Hi everyone, my name is Oli Pinson-Roxburgh, CEO at Bulletproof, and my presentation today is all about how hackers hide, and really looking at why everyone feels like they're being hacked by China and what that means for your business. A bit about me before we get started. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO at Bulletproof. I've been in the industry for over 15 years. I've got extensive experience in sort of SIM technologies. I've been a pen tester, I've done consulting, in general, a security evangelist, really passionate about security, and I've spoken at a number of different events, and also tend to talk a lot to media outlets about my thoughts around cybersecurity. A bit about Bulletproof. So we're a total security service provider, which basically means that we provide lots of different services. And we're partnered with EACS providing sort of penetration testing services, consulting, and also our SWAT defense service, which is a managed SIM solution providing 24/7 security operations and research for our customers. As a company, we release an annual security report every year. We've just launched our 2021, so take a look at it. It's a really interesting read, and there's some really good data in there that will help you to drive your security strategy for the next year, and help you to see the real threats that your business might be facing. One of the things that the organization is known for is being a pioneer of innovation in the field, in our fields, and what we provide as a security solutions are always very innovative and simple to help make sure organizations aren't burdened with complex security solutions. Before I get started on my presentation, I wanted to tell you a story. My story starts in 2018 in South Korea. For those that remember, this was the year of the Winter Olympics, and these events are huge. I mean, they have serious IT infrastructure. They have over 150 IT staff at the event throughout the period. Of course, they have like phone apps, they have Wi-Fi, they have ticketing systems, they have gate and entry systems that they have to manage and maintain and keep up to date. So they have a NOC, 24/7 NOC. They have multiple data centers. But that's not the reason for sort of talking about this and saying the complexity, of course, is there from a security standpoint. It's more about what happened during the event. So 10 seconds before 8 p.m., I think it was, on the day of the opening ceremony, the head of IT is sat in the crowd watching the opening ceremony about to start, thinking that they're in a good place, that everything seems to be operating correctly. They've done a lot of preparation. Obviously, the teams are all there in preparation to deal with it. And his phone starts blowing up, and so he starts looking down through the messages, and their domain controllers are being taken offline and being wiped. So of course your initial reaction, I'm sure, is to think, well, this must just be a general issue. I need to go sort out. So he heads out from the opening ceremony off to where his teams are, to go and help figure out what the problem is. And it was causing massive disruption because these domain controllers were being wiped in their environment by a worm and essentially a piece of malware that was deliberately sabotaging the games. And when you think about the sort of size of these sorts of events and the impact that this would have, is that it just started crashing everything. The ticketing systems were falling over. It turns out that, and they didn't realize, but some people couldn't even get access to the opening ceremony because the domain controllers are used to authenticate pretty much everything on that network. And so it's so crucial. It's a massive, crucial part of your infrastructure. And these the IT environment that the 150 IT staff are having to manage is 10,000 plus PCs, 20,000 mobile devices, 6,000 plus Wi-Fi routers, like 300 servers across multiple data centers. So it's a huge system to try and manage. And what's really interesting, of course, is that they were well prepared. They've been planning for this for years. I mean, their IT security team had met more than 20 times to do drills and to really think through the security challenges that they might face during the event. And yet they were still in a situation where they'd been hit by an attack. So they'd invested serious money and time and effort into this. So the domain controller stayed down throughout the period of the opening ceremony, and the IT team essentially had to spend the night to try and get everything back online. They had to rebuild the domain controllers several times. Every time they rebuilt them, they'd get wiped again. So in the end, they had to take the drastic decision to turn off their network completely. They managed to contain the malware, which meant the worm, so that it wasn't able to propagate any further. They could bring their domain controllers back up online, and by 8 a.m. the next morning, they managed to get everything back online. So a great story, because it shows the resiliency of an IT team and their ability to bring a system back online under serious pressure. But that's not really the interesting part for me about this story. The interesting part is post the event and post the actual attack, because when analysts and researchers started looking at the malware, they were trying to, of course, identify who did the attack. And attribution is really tough. And you're probably thinking, okay, now I understand where we're going with this presentation, because I started out the presentation by saying that why are we always getting everybody? Why does it always feel like we're being hacked by China? Well, from an attribution point of view, this malware was particularly significant because when they started pulling the code apart, there were bits of code. And so, yeah, let me take a step back, I guess, is that when you're investigating malware like this, one of the big things you're trying to do is find bits of code that might link it to another attack that could be attributed to a particular attacker. So in a lot of cases around these nation state style attacks, it's always looking back at previous attacks by different nation states and saying, well, what technologies did they use? What code did they use? And when you link those two things together, then of course you can come to some conclusion around who would have performed the attack. But in this scenario, when analysts were looking at the data, when they were researching and going through the code, there were lots of different bits of code kind of pulled together into this piece of malware, which is not uncommon. You know, obviously attackers reuse other people's code in order to, if it's working well, of course, why not use it? But in this case, it landed up linking, the code links back to several different attacks by lots of different nation state attackers. Russian hackers, North Korean hackers, China, and of course, all of them have motive for this. Obviously, North Korea is at war with South Korea. China, in general, tends to do a lot of hacking, and then Russia, of course, at the time weren't allowed to go to the event because they were banned. So, who was it? That was the real interesting question. And why also would they be wanting to take down the Olympic Games? Why would they want to use such destructive technologies? So that's a bit of backstory, but to just go over a couple of the key points. Olympic Destroyer was the name given to this attack. It was a cyber sabotage attack. It spread by a destructive network worm functionality, so essentially trying to propagate to many different systems, and eventually once it finds the systems that it's interested in, obviously the task was to take down those systems. There were clues in the code that suggested it was linked to Russia, North Korea, or China. They didn't know at the time which, of course. Eventually it was discovered, and if you stick around for the rest of the presentation, towards the end I'll talk finish up the story, I guess, and give you some of the takeaways from the story, further takeaways from the story, should I say, and also we'll tell you who the actual attack was attributed to. But the one key thing out of all of this is that the attackers used some common tools as well. So they didn't just use custom-made, custom-written code, which often these nation-state attackers will do because they've got, of course, the top hackers, and they tend to write their own malware. They were also using off-the-shelf, open-source technologies, and that's what I'm going to be talking a bit about today. Okay. So let's start by explaining what a hacker is. And I've just obviously taken the straight dictionary description of a hacker. A hacker is a computer expert who uses their technical knowledge to achieve a certain goal. or overcome certain obstacles within computerized systems. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because a lot of the time when being asked, people say, well, hackers are getting smarter, right? They're always finding new ways to hack us. And I'm like, and I'm thinking, well, yeah, the definition of a hacker pretty much explains exactly that. The idea is that you're trying to find new and interesting ways to attack systems, overcome obstacles. So they are, of course, by description, always going to get smarter because that's what they're doing. They're finding new and interesting ways around the security controls and finding new vulnerabilities. So they're pretty much their job is to continue to get smarter and learn new things. Of course, throughout the years, I've always said that I tend to see the same old attacks over and over and over again. So if it's working, then they'll continue to use those methods. So we do have to get the basics right in order to make sure that we don't land up falling foul of the obvious, easy, quick wins, the low-hanging fruit, as we call it in the security industry. Those easy vulnerabilities that attackers will just scour the internet trying to find targets to exploit. So we have to get the basics right. But yeah, of course, attackers are smart. They're always learning. They're always finding new things. But are they continually evolving? Yeah, it's a bit of an arms race, of course. Hackers, once they find new security tools, they're always finding these new ways around those systems in order to achieve their ultimate goals. And of course, we're not seeing breaches decline. If anything, we're kind of seeing it continually grow. But like I said, hackers tend to be relatively lazy because they can reuse technologies, because we're often leaving the door open. We're not putting a lot of the obvious simple controls in place to stop the attackers. And I'm not talking about new technology. I'm talking about just general best practices. Thinking about developing secure code, thinking about turning on those key features within technologies that ensure that we don't make it easy for those hackers. So we just need to get the basics right often in order to give ourselves a better chance of fending off the hackers, or at least pointing them in the direction of somebody who's less secure than we are or you are as a business. It's easy to ignore security because it's way too hard to get it right from the very beginning, and it's an evolution. It's continually improving security over time. And it's also very difficult often to scale fast and do things quickly, which we all are under pressure to do these days while implementing security. But it's a worthwhile endeavor to get that right from the very beginning. Hackers are just smart. So then that gets me onto, well, yeah, okay, hackers are smart. How are they getting smarter? And what are they doing to make our jobs harder? Well, the first thing is they're trying to make it harder to detect them in the first place. They are also looking at attribution, and they're also testing organizations. So their first test is, can you see me doing the basics? Because if they get wind of an organization trying to boot them out of an environment, then that might make an organization a less interesting target for that particular attacker. They're always trying to find new ways to monetize their attacks. They're obviously still finding net new vulnerabilities. Otherwise, of course, only those legacy systems would be being hacked. But the key thing for me is around this attribution part, because what we've been identifying over time from a security point of view is that hackers have always used their kind of own custom tools. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, they tend to write their own software in order to achieve their goals. However, more recently that's changing, and we're not seeing hackers using their custom code anymore because it gives a fingerprint of that particular attacker. It's a way to attribute that attack back to that individual. And so they're being smart because they've started using tools that are sort of off-the-shelf open source tools that anybody could use, which makes it very difficult to attribute that attack back to that individual or group, hacker group. So let me try and answer this burning question I keep getting asked. So is everyone really being targeted by China? Well, we know China is very cyber hostile. They do tend to have a name for themselves around nation state style attacks, and obviously state based hacking activities, and of course we know that there have been many different hacks linked back to China in the news and the press. So, yeah, of course, they probably are targeting a good proportion of the internet at any one time, and they're always looking for new targets to facilitate their attacks. If you think about the best way into other nation states is to attack kind of core infrastructure backbones, internet backbones, things like that. And so they have been known to go after commercial organizations in order to facilitate their nation state style attacking. So it's not uncommon for an organization to become a target, a commercial organization to become a target for nation state attackers. The other key thing, of course, from an attribution point of view is it's relatively easy, as we've already seen, to try and divert people's ability to detect a particular or link something back to a particular hacking group or an individual, because of course you can do things like geolocation spoofing, you can use anonymous proxies, you can bounce off lots of different servers, you can legitimately buy many different servers, access to servers on the internet without actually requiring real information. So you could register a cheap server hosted somewhere in a country that doesn't really control who can rent these servers, and you can use that system to hack. Of course, attackers can also target other businesses who may have a weak security and use them to facilitate their attacks. So the key thing here is that it's quite difficult often to link it back to an individual or a nation state hacking somebody. The other thing to consider as well is that often the attackers are deliberately trying to put you off the scent, and obviously, as we've seen in the case of the attacks against the Winter Olympics, that was definitely the case. They were trying to point fingers at all different organizations or countries, should I say, in order to try and not have their attack be linked back to them as an individual nation state. Now, this does, of course, change your strategy, your security, or should change your security strategy around SIM and MDR, because, of course, one of the key things that organizations that are doing a good job of monitoring their environments is to really understand what normal looks like in their organization. And they have a really good understanding of what their profile as an organization looks like, because that's how you ultimately are able to tune out a lot of this noise around the data. So let's have a look at this data we have here. Over 40% of the attacks that we have monitored or hacker attempts against the environments that we're monitoring land up coming from China. 42% being China, 26% being Russia, 9% being the US, and then of course it kind of peters off through to all different countries after that. So our data certainly suggests that it looks like it's very much biased to certain countries where we're seeing these attacks. But like I say, the key thing here is it doesn't necessarily mean that China has been targeting our customers necessarily. It's just that it's easy to hide yourself behind China because they're the most likely to be targeting businesses and the internet in general. So that then brings on the question, well, what data can we really trust, and what should we focus our time on and investment on from a security standpoint? Should we be looking to go out there and start blocking all this traffic? And how do we make the decision to block traffic, especially in the scenario where we're under pressure because we feel like we're under attack? So we did some research on this, and we have honeypot systems that are sat out on the internet. And what we did was we took the data from the honeypot systems, and out of 9,000 IP addresses that we had identified as bad actors because they hit our honeypot systems, which are not legitimate servers in any way, they're not actually advertised on the internet. So someone would have come across our asset or in this case 9,000 different IP addresses came across our assets, and we're poking around to find out what it was and to try and essentially look for vulnerabilities on those systems. Now, we took the IP addresses that we had detected from this activity, and we gave those IP addresses to a number of commercial and open source intelligence feeds, and out of all of those IP addresses, only 1.7% were known to be bad. But it was clear that these systems should not be communicated with from any asset on the internet, because it's not a server that's legitimately used by any business or employee. So it definitely puts into question what intel can you trust. And it also, of course, asks the question, well, are hackers a real threat to my business if everything on the internet becomes a target and is hit by thousands of IP addresses every day? Well, of course, as I mentioned before, often it's down to the opportunistic attackers as to why we see an increased amount of traffic. While businesses are being scrutinized purely because there are a lot of opportunistic attackers taking away the original discussion around these nation states, which, like I said, are relatively targeted. They tend to go after specific targets that will benefit their ultimate goal. The opportunistic attackers are more about making money, and their focus is always on the easy wins, those low-hanging fruits. And so they are going to be scouring the internet looking for your assets. They're going to be looking for vulnerable systems that they know they can exploit, and they can do this kind of rinse and repeat exploit every time. So if we look at things like default credentials, why is it so significant, and why in our data is it such a significant data set? We take, again, the data from creds that are being used to try and compromise these assets that are sat out on the internet. And just 3 usernames and password combos account for 85% of the attacks against our honeypot systems. And there's a good reason for that, because they tend to work. The opportunistic hackers are still using the default creds because the default creds are successful in exploiting organizations, exploiting systems out on the internet. So they continue to use them. And like I say, if it isn't broke, they continue to use it, and it tends to be successful. So targeted attacks, of course, go much further than this, but they tend to use the same common techniques. In the example of the Olympic Games, they still use phishing, a phishing attack, to deliver the malware to the Olympic Games, which of course is a tried and tested approach. And we've seen an increase in that as well, in the success of that, should I say, in the success of phishing campaigns in the more recent data that we have on in our security report. So with all that being said, how do they do it? So they tend to be using these off-the-shelf tools, open source technologies, and even actually buying commercial solutions that they will then use in their attacks. So hackers will use in their attacks to try and exploit these systems, and they will use these tools because it gives them an opportunity to really test the security of the organizations they're trying to exploit. Because if they get detected, then they know that they've got a fairly mature security model. If they don't detect these, then it could be that they're using technologies that are either out of date or are not configured correctly, and or they just don't have a security team monitoring. So they're going to be testing the maturity of your systems, the maturity of your security, in order to decide if they continue their attack in the environment, or if they might get thwarted and blocked or taken down. So in the case of this open source tools, of course you can just readily download them, and of course with the commercial technologies they'll be going out there to buy licenses for those systems. So what I thought I'd do is I'd take the opportunity to demonstrate some of these open source tools and how they can be used in an attack. So for this demo, what I thought I'd do is actually demonstrate an off-the-shelf tool used by hackers and also penetration testers alike. It's a tool called Metasploit. Now, what we're doing here is we've managed to find a vulnerability in an Windows system, a system running IIS, and we've already found the vulnerability and we've managed to exploit it. So we have essentially a session. So this is where the vulnerable system has been exploited, and it's created a session back to the attacker's machine. So what the attacker's doing here, or what I'm able to do here, is interact with that session, that session 5 that has given us a connection back from the server. The server's come back to us, and we can see that we have managed to exploit the system with a default application pool user account. Now, with this account, we don't have a lot of permissions, so we can get a shell, so we can get access to the command line on the system. But if we try and do an upload, for example, this malicious PNG, this malicious image to the user's desktop, you'll see that it will fail. It will give us an access denied because we don't have high enough permissions. Now, this is where these sorts of tools become really useful, and I've got to remind you, of course, this is an open source tool, so it's freely available for anybody to download. Now, what this tool allows you to do is it allows you to interrogate the system to see if there are any vulnerabilities that it could use to exploit. So it has something called an exploit suggester, which is part of the recon process. So what we're going to do here is we're going to pick up that session we had, our session 5, and we're going to give the exploit suggester the opportunity to go and run it against the local system. So it pulls in all the exploits that it has available, and it will go and interrogate the system to see if any of those exploits would be successful. Now, what we're going to be trying to do here is escalate our permissions. So we're trying to take our user from having very basic permissions, exploit it, and then give us an admin style permissions, often looking to get something called system level access, which is the highest level of access. So here are all the options. We've got like 4 or 5 options there for us to try and use. And in this case, we're going to use this reflection juicy exploit here. And we're going to use that to exploit the system, create another session back. So create another connection back to our hacker's machine. And then we're going to see if we can run that same attempt to upload malicious files to the system that we did before. So again, opening up the session, running the exploit against that session 5, and then the exploit that says it's finished there and it's waiting for the payload to execute and complete. And now we have a new session, and we are now logged in with the system level user, which, as I said, is the highest level of permissions on this system, which means now what we can do is we can then upload that file again, now with the higher level of permissions that we had previously, which means that we should be able to see that file being dropped onto the desktop of that user, which means that essentially we can do whatever we want with this machine now. We can upload files, we can run executables, we can take full control over this server and do whatever we want with it. So you can see how trivial it is, how easy it is for somebody with a very simple user interface to exploit a system, to get access, and to pretty much take full control over those systems with open source tools. So hopefully you found the demo useful, but I'm not just going to leave it there. Of course, I'm not going to leave you with there's all this doom and gloom and what am I supposed to do about this? Best practices, of course, are the best approach. Start by getting the basics right. Like I say, if the attackers are targeting using default credentials for systems, and our honeypots are getting hit every single day, and all manner of different IP addresses to keep hitting our systems and attempting to log in with these default credentials. At some stage, if you are not following best practices, those attacks are going to be successful, and it's just a matter of time before you get targeted and accounts get taken over. So how do you solve the general problems, and what are my tips for ensuring that you are staying protected? So first and foremost, of course, just look for a trusted security partner that can help to really understand what the requirements are for your business, and becomes an extension of your team as opposed to just wanting to sell you an off-the-shelf solution that can just address your security needs and leave it to you to try and deal with that problem. Pen test regularly, because of course it's simulating in essence simulating a malicious hacker attempting to gain access to your systems. But between those penetration tests, there's often a gap where you may not be doing regular assessments of your security. So vulnerability scanning is a good way to just keep a good understanding of what your latest security posture looks like, how big is your attack surface area, and of course addressing any of those vulnerabilities that do come up. Make sure you're doing proactive monitoring using SIM or MDR type services, but of course consider the intelligence data, because like I said earlier, when we're doing our investigations, we tend to find that intel is good, but it really needs to be properly investigated. It needs to be well understood by your teams. And if you don't have the expertise, then look for a partner that can help you to really understand what you should be doing with that data, and also to make sure that your intelligence is relevant to your environment, because often you can be screamed at with all this great intel, but half of it's not relevant to your business and your systems you're running. So making it relevant is key to make intelligence useful. And being proactive about security, it helps you to really spot the early signs of an attack in order to make sure that you can deal with the threat as early as possible. And regardless of what that location is or where the attacks are coming from, you should take it just as serious, whether it's potentially China, or you might even disregard it because of the fact that it says China and you think, well, there's no way they're going to be targeting me. The other thing, of course, to just consider the internal threat, the chance of kind of rogue employees that are already inside of your perimeter. So it's not always about the outside coming in, it's also about the inside going out. So that's it. Thanks very much for listening to my presentation, and come to the stand to find out more. I'm sure everybody's probably thinking, I hope he's going to tell me about who the actual hacker was for the Olympic Games. So I will leave on this note. It was through lots of different investigation, all the way through from analyzing every piece of code, that they couldn't actually attribute it to any one nation state, purely based on the malware that they had for the Olympic Games. But what one smart researcher did was he went back to look not just at the malware, but to look at the delivery mechanism for that malware, and found out that there was a technique that was used by Russia previously in another attack that was very similar to the method that was used during the Olympic Games. And that method was to create emails that had a Word document with macros, heavily obfuscated macros within it, used again an off-the-shelf open source commercial tool to build those macros, very difficult to detect by malware, anti-malware and other systems. And in essence, when they looked at that particular method of delivery, they managed to find a particular domain name that then linked it back directly to another attack, that attack being an attack on the US elections, which I'm sure everybody knows by now has been attributed to Russia meddling in US elections. And they used the exact same domain name for that attack as they did on the attack against the Olympics, the Winter Olympics, which really linked it to it. And in actual fact, since then, there's been some really interesting comments coming out of the US government now that are actually have openly said that they believe that Russia sabotaged the Olympic Games. So yeah, make sure to drop by the stand, and we would love to talk to you more about what services we can provide, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.